Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a mountain trail in Tennessee on the 8th of October, 1976, and to a 16-year-old girl named Trenny Lynn Gibson, who walked around a bend ahead of her classmates and never came back. She was on a school field trip. Her ornamental horticulture class from Bearden High School in Knoxville had ridden a bus into Great Smoky Mountains National Park that morning, and by early afternoon, they were spread out along a trail near the highest point in the park, walking back toward the parking lot in small clusters of friends. Trenny was a fast walker. She kept passing groups, joining them for a few minutes and moving on ahead. Around 3 o'clock, 2 of her classmates watched her crouch down at the edge of the trail as though something had caught her eye, and then step off it to the right, downhill, into the ferns. When they looked again a few seconds later, she was gone. There was no side trail there. There were people ahead of her and people behind her. Nobody heard a sound. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually find value in what we do here. No pressure, no guilt. And thank you so much to everyone who suggested this case. Truly. We're also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you want to listen there too. Now dim those lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Trenny's story deserves to be heard carefully. She was a quiet girl who wanted to study landscape architecture at the University of Tennessee, which is why she was in the horticulture class in the first place. She had a poodle named Mitzi who used to climb onto the back of the upstairs couch and watch out the window for her when she was gone. Let's step back for a moment. How does a teenager vanish in daylight on a maintained trail in the most visited national park in the country, surrounded by other people? Why did 6 separate dog teams follow her scent away from the woods and out to a road? And why did the search continue in the woods anyway? And if she never left that park, as one cold case investigator now argues, then why has the federal file on her disappearance stayed closed for half a century, through 2 of her siblings dying, and her father dying, and her mother growing old asking for it? To understand any of that, we need to know who Trenny Gibson was. Let's talk about Knoxville, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1976. You're in a house on Whittower Drive in the west end of the city, in a neighborhood of modest brick homes with chain-link fences and carports and dogwoods going yellow at the edges. The bicentennial year is winding down, and there are still faded flags in some of the windows. A window air conditioning unit sits unused now that the nights have turned. Inside, 4 kids share the noise of a single bathroom in the morning, and the oldest of them has just come home on leave from the Navy. Trenny Lynn Gibson had been called Trenny for as long as anyone could remember. She was born in Knoxville in August of 1960, the second of 4 children, and by the autumn of 1976, she had just turned 16. She was small, about 5'3" and 115 pounds, with long brown hair she kept carefully and green eyes. People who knew her then used the same handful of words about her, and they have used those words consistently for 50 years now, which is worth something in a case where almost nothing else has stayed consistent. Quiet and nice, and a good student, and not a girl who ever caused anybody any problems. Her father, Robert Gibson Sr., everyone called him Bob, traveled for work. Her mother, Hope, ran the household. Her older brother, Robert Jr., also called Bob, was 19 and in the Navy. Her younger sister, Tina, was 14. The youngest was a little boy of 5. The family was religious and attended Calvary Baptist Tabernacle regularly, and by every account, religion was not a light thing in that house, but a structure that shaped the weak. Trenny worked. She had a job at Morrison's cafeteria in the mall, and she was careful with the money, the way some 16-year-olds are careful, and most are not. She put nearly all of it into a savings account, and by that autumn she had accumulated something over $1,000 in it, with a couple of hundred more in a drawer at home. Accounts differ on the exact figure. Some sources put the savings closer to 2,000. What matters is not the number, but what it meant, which is that a girl who worked cafeteria shifts after school had built up a real sum of money and had touched none of it. Have you ever wondered what a 16-year-old in 1976 was saving for? In Trenny's case, we actually know. She wanted to go to the University of Tennessee and study landscape architecture. She was interested in plants and trees and growing things in a specific and studious way rather than a vague one. And that interest is the reason she was enrolled in ornamental horticulture at Bearden High School under a teacher named Wayne Dunlap. She was not on that field trip by accident or because it got her out of another class. She was on it because the subject was the thing she had decided she wanted to spend her life on. There is a detail from that autumn that says something about her. A couple of weeks before the field trip, she had stepped on a small stone and punctured the sole of her foot. It had become infected enough that she was on an antibiotic for it. She was still walking, still working, still going to school and still planning to hike, but she was taking the medication daily. The bottle stayed at home on the 8th of October. She would have needed it that night, and she had Mitzi. The family poodle was 7 years old that autumn, and Trenny was the one Mitzi waited for. Her father described it later to a reporter in the flat, exhausted way that people describe things in the first days of a search, when they are answering questions about the dog because the questions about their daughter have no answers. Mitzi would get up on the back of the couch upstairs and look out the window, watching for her. And she had been doing it for 3 days by then. Now picture the household on the 7th of October, the night before. Bob Jr. was home from the Navy on leave. By every account in this case, and this is one of the few things nobody disputes, Trenny and her older brother were extremely close. Years later, he held 2 fingers pressed together to show a reporter how close, and said there was no way she would go anywhere when she knew he was coming home. No way. He had asked a friend of his, a senior named Robert Simpson, to keep an eye on his sister on the field trip because Trenny had never been away from her family for a full day before. Remember that sentence. A 16-year-old who had never spent an entire day away from her family. To be fair to what came later, there are people who knew that family who described the house very differently. Longtime researchers on this case, including a woman named Laura Rister, who has spent years interviewing classmates and relatives, have said that things were tense in the Gibson home well before Trenny vanished. She has said Trenny was given the household responsibilities her siblings were not, that she was treated something like a maid, and that at least some people who knew her wondered whether she was unhappy enough to leave if a chance appeared. Rist has also said the family kept secrets, among them a disapproval of Trenny's interest in black boys. Her parents rejected all of that in the strongest possible terms and maintained for the rest of their lives that Trenny never dated and had no interest in boys at all. We are going to come back to those competing pictures because they matter enormously to how you read the rest of this. For now, it is enough to hold both of them loosely. A quiet girl with a savings account, a foot infection, a dog waiting at the window, a brother home on leave, and a future she had already picked out. And possibly a home life that was heavier than the neighbors knew. Both of those can be true at once. Most families contain more than one story about themselves. There are two objects in this case that will matter more than they should, and both of them belong to her. So let's talk about them now, while they are still ordinary. The first is a comb. Trenny carried a large, thick Stanley comb, the kind made for long hair. Her sister had one too. By every account from the family, Trenny was never without hers. It lived in a pocket or a purse, and it went where she went. The second is a ring. She wore a star, sapphire, and diamond ring that had been a gift from her family, and she had a matching pendant. In 1976, that ring was appraised at around $600, which was not pocket money for a family like hers. Adjusted forward, it would be something in the range of $3,000 today. It was the most valuable thing she owned, and she was wearing it on the 8th of October. Hold on to both of those, a comb and a ring, in a case with no body, no scene, and no confession. Those two small objects end up carrying more weight than any of the theories built on top of them. Let's talk about the field trip itself, because it was planned badly, and the way it was planned is the first thing in this story that could have gone differently. Wayne Dunlap taught ornamental horticulture at Bearden High School. He was, by every account, including the ones that criticized the trip, a teacher who cared about the subject and about his students, and the field trip was a real educational outing rather than a day off. The students were going to walk a trail and observe the trees and shrubs and flowering plants along it at elevation in the season when the deciduous canopy turns and the spruce and fir stay dark. For a class studying plants in East Tennessee, there is no better classroom within a 2-hour drive. The problem was supervision. Dunlap had trouble finding adults willing to give up a Friday to chaperone. He asked, and people declined. And in the end, he could not put together the number of adults a trip like that needed. Trenny's own mother was supposed to be one of them. Hope Gibson had agreed to come along, and then, at the last minute, she could not find anybody to watch her 5-year-old, so she stayed home. Think about that for a second, and then think about her carrying it for the next 50 years. So on the morning of the 8th of October, the trip went ahead with one adult supervising the students on the trail, plus a bus driver who stayed with the bus in the parking lot. Sources differ on exactly how many teenagers were on board, and the disagreement is worth naming rather than smoothing over, because it tells you how thin the paperwork on this case is. The National Park Service records and most published accounts describe 38 classmates plus Trenny, which makes 39 students. Some accounts round it to about 40. A cold case investigator who has worked the file in recent years puts the number at 33. What nobody disputes is the ratio, somewhere between 30 and 40 teenagers and one teacher on a network of trails inside a park the size of a small county. Her father said something about that later in an interview in 1981, 5 years on, and he said it as a man who had been a scout and a scoutmaster himself and knew what supervision was supposed to look like. He was careful and generous about the searchers and the federal agents who had worked his daughter's case. What he could not forgive was the school district, and specifically the arithmetic. One adult for 39 students, he said, was at least 3 chaperones too few. To be fair to Wayne Dunlap, nothing in the record suggests he was careless with the students once they were out of the bus. He gave them clear instructions. He told them to stay on the trail, not to take side trails, not to go past the bald, and not to disturb the plant life. And he made them raise their hands to confirm they had heard him. He set a hard meeting time. Then he walked the trail himself. He simply could not be in 9 places at once because no one can, and the school had sent him out there alone. And there is one more piece of the arrangement worth noting before we get on the bus. Trenny's brother Bob, home on leave and unable to come along, had asked his friend Robert Simpson to look out for her that day. Simpson was 17, a senior, a year ahead of Trenny in school, and he had a car and had been to the park before. It was a small, ordinary favor, the kind of thing an older brother asks a friend when his little sister is nervous about being away from home. Almost 50 years later, that favor is still the most argued over detail in this entire case. Let's talk about the mountain, because in this case, the geography is not background. It is the single most important thing in the story after Trenny herself. And almost every theory about what happened to her stands or falls on what that ground is actually like. Great Smoky Mountains National Park straddles the state line between Tennessee and North Carolina along the crest of the Great Smokies, which are part of the Blue Ridge, which are part of the Appalachians. The park covers something over 520,000 acres. That is more than 800 square miles of protected land, most of it steep, most of it forested, a great deal of it without a trail anywhere near it. It is the most visited national park in the United States, and it has been for decades, which produces a strange double impression. Millions of people a year experience the Smokies as a scenic drive with an overlook and a gift shop. A quarter-mile off the pavement, it is one of the more effectively hostile landscapes in the eastern half of the country. The name comes from the Cherokee, the people who lived in these mountains long before the park existed, called the region Chaconage, which is usually translated as place of the blue smoke, for the haze that settles in the folds of the ridges and hangs there. The park was chartered by Congress in 1934 and dedicated by President Roosevelt in 1940, assembled out of donated state land and land bought from the farmers and timber companies and paper mills that had been working it. Communities that had names and post offices and cemeteries were bought out and absorbed. The Civilian Conservation Corps came through in the 30s and built the roads and bridges and campgrounds and many of the trails that visitors still use. The highest point in the park is a summit the Cherokee call Kuohi, which translates as Mulberry Place. It rises to 6,643 feet, the 3rd highest peak east of the Mississippi River, and it is a sacred place for the Cherokee, visited by a medicine people who came up there to pray and to seek guidance on matters facing their nation. For most of the 20th century, the maps called it Clingmans Dome, after a 19th century North Carolina senator, a name given to it by a surveyor. In 2024, at the formal request of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and with the support of the National Park Service, the federal board that governs place names restored the name Kuohi. In 1976, when Trenny's bus climbed that road, every sign and every map and every one of those students would have said Clingmans Dome, a paved road runs 7 miles from Newfound Gap out to a large parking lot just under the summit. And from that lot, a steep half-mile walkway climbs to a concrete observation tower with a spiral ramp and a view in every direction on the days when there is a view at all. The road closes for the winter on the 1st of December and reopens in the spring. The Appalachian Trail crosses the summit there on its way from Georgia to Maine, and Kuohai is the highest point on the entire 2,000-mile length of it. And from the front end of that parking lot, another trail starts. The Forney Ridge Trail is one of the very few trails in the park that begins by going down rather than up, because it starts near the top of everything. The first stretch is a set of rocky, leveled platforms the Park Service built to tame a slope that was dangerous without them. A short way in, a side path branches off and climbs to the Appalachian Trail, half a mile up. The Forney Ridge Trail itself continues left and down along the ridge it is named for. At a little over a mile it forks, with the Forney Creek Trail dropping away to the right and running 11 miles down to Fontana Lake. From that junction, the main trail rises briefly, the only real climb on it, then levels and slopes gently down to Andrews Bald at about 1.75 miles from the parking lot. Andrews Bald sits at 5,920 feet, and it is the highest grassy bald in the park. A bald is an open meadow on a mountaintop where you would expect forest, and nobody is entirely certain why they exist. Grazing kept them open for generations. In June, the Catawba rhododendron and flame azalea there put on the best display in the park for the least walking. In October, it is a cold, open field of brown grass at the top of the world with the forest pressing in at the edges, and it is a beautiful place to eat a sandwich. That is the trail. Round trip from the parking lot to the Bald and back is roughly 3.5 miles on a well-used path. On a clear autumn Friday, it is an easy afternoon. The 8th of October, 1976, was not a clear autumn Friday. You're in Knoxville that morning, and it is grey and wet and raw. Rain is coming and going. Trenny actually asked another student on the way in whether the trip was still on, because she assumed weather like that would cancel it, and she was told it was going ahead. Her mother dropped her at Bearden High because she expected the trip to be called off, and because she was 16, she left her coat behind. She also left her purse and her school books in her mother's car. She took her bagged lunch and got on the bus. The bus pulled out around 9 in the morning. The destination had been kept secret from the students until they were seated, and Dunlap explained the reason for that afterward, which is a detail that has aged strangely. He had withheld it so that nobody outside the class would know where the teenagers were going and be able to follow them there. When he announced that they were headed for the Great Smoky Mountains and Clingmans Dome, the bus was pleased. It was a good destination, better than most. Trenny sat in the back with Robert Simpson. The senior, her brother, had asked to look out for her. He would say later that they talked the whole way and that she was in good spirits, and at some point in the ride, or possibly on arrival, he lent her his jacket. It was a heavy plaid wool CPO coat, brown and orange in the accounts that described the color, distinctive enough that people would recognize it later in a photograph. Trenny had come dressed for a classroom rather than a ridgeline. Blue jeans, a blue blouse, a blue and white striped sweater, and a pair of blue Adidas sneakers. She had no rain shell, no hat, and no gloves with her. The jacket she was wearing when she disappeared was not hers. The bus climbed Newfound Gap Road and then the 7 miles out to the Clingmans Dome parking lot, and it parked there sometime around noon. Sources put the arrival between noon and 12:30. You're in that parking lot now, and I want you to feel what those students walked into. You have just come up more than a mile in elevation from Knoxville. The temperature at 6,000 feet in October in the southern Appalachians runs 20 degrees or more colder than the valley, and on a wet day, it sits in the 40s. The fog is not the picturesque haze from the postcards. It is inside the parking lot with you, moving, thick enough that the far end of the lot goes soft. Everything is wet. The spruce and fir smell like a Christmas tree lot in the rain. There is a low, steady wind coming over the ridge that makes 40 degrees feel like something considerably worse when you're in jeans and a sweater. Hoarfrost has been forming and melting on the vegetation. The rock platforms at the head of the trail are slick. Dunlap gathered them and gave the instructions. They would take the Forney Ridge Trail down to Andrews Bald, observe the plant life along the way, and turn around. They were not to go past the Bald. They were not to take side trails. They were to stay on the trail at all times, and they were to be back at the bus by 3:30 at the latest. He asked them to raise their hands to confirm they had understood, and they did. Then 39 teenagers walked into the fog. They broke into small groups almost immediately, the way any group of teenagers does, sorting themselves by friendship and walking pace. Fast walkers pulled ahead, slower clusters strung out behind. Within 20 minutes, the class was distributed along nearly 2 miles of trail, with one adult somewhere in the middle of it. And there were other hikers out there too. Ordinary park visitors on an ordinary Friday, mixed into the gaps between the students. Trenny walked down to the Bald with Robert Simpson, wearing his coat. Have you ever wondered how many small, reversible decisions have to line up before something becomes irreversible? A cancelled babysitter, a coat left in a car, a rainy forecast that did not cancel the trip, a teacher who could not find enough adults, and a destination kept secret for safety. Every one of those was a reasonable choice made by a reasonable person, and not one of them was a mistake in any sense that would have mattered on any other Friday in 1976. Now, we come to the part of this case that has been reconstructed and re-reconstructed for half a century. And I want to walk it slowly, because the whole thing happens inside about 90 minutes, and the disagreements are all in the minutes. Trenny and Robert Simpson reached Andrews Bald and sat down to eat. That much is agreed. They were in an open meadow near 6,000 feet in the fog, eating packed lunches, with classmates scattered around the Bald and along the trail behind them. She ate about half of hers. Then she said she wanted to start back toward the bus, and he said he wanted to stay up on the Bald a while longer. The times given for that moment do not agree with each other. The most detailed reconstruction from the park records has her leaving the Bald at around 1:30 in the afternoon. Another well-sourced account puts it at 10 minutes to 2. The gap is only 20 minutes, and it would not matter at all except that the last confirmed sighting of her is around 3 o'clock, and 1.75 miles of easy downhill trail does not take a fast 16-year-old walker 90 minutes. So either she left later than the earliest accounts say, or she stopped along the way, or she spent time with groups that nobody has properly counted, or one of the times written down in 1976 was simply wrong. We do not know which. This is the first of several places In this case, where the record thins out exactly where you want it to be thick. What we do know is that she went alone, and she went in his jacket. She was a fast walker, and she started catching people. Angela Beckner, Lisa Michaels, and Bobby Coghill were walking together when Trenny came up behind them. Bobby described it plainly afterward. She said she'd been walking with Angela and Lisa when Trenny came up from behind, that Trenny was walking faster than they were, and so she started walking with Trenny instead. The two of them went on together, and after a while, caught up with two more classmates, Anita Rounds and Scott Troy. For about 5 minutes, there were 4 of them on the trail together. Then that group wanted to stop and rest. Trenny did not. They invited her to sit down with them, and she declined and kept going. They were, by Anita's account, somewhere between 1/2 mile and 3/4 of a mile from the Clingmans Dome parking lot, which is to say, the bus was close. Not around the corner, but close enough that on a normal afternoon, you would be there inside 20 minutes at a stroll. Close enough that the group resting on the trail had no reason on earth to worry about a girl who wanted to walk on ahead. You're in that spot now. It is early afternoon and the light is flat and grey under a canopy of spruce and fir on a north-facing ridge, so it feels later than it is. The trail here is moderately steep with sharp drop-offs, and it is narrow. On both sides of it, the ground falls away into thick shrubbery, waist-high ferns going brown and collapsing with the season, wet rock and blow down. There is a small creek running somewhere below. There is no side path. The undergrowth is dense enough that a person who steps off the trail is out of sight within a few strides and inaudible not long after, because rhododendron and fern absorb sound the way heavy curtains do. It smells like cold, wet earth and balsam. Your jeans are damp from the knee down. Somewhere ahead of you, out of sight in the fog, a school bus is idling in a parking lot. Anita Rounds gave the account that has been quoted more than any other sentence in this case. She said the group was watching Trenny walk away from them down the trail. Trenny stopped. She crouched down, and it looked to them as though she had noticed something off to the right of the trail, the downhill side. Then she moved off the trail to the right. A classmate named David Eastham came up the trail from behind. Anita looked at him for a moment. When she looked back down the trail, Trenny was not there. They called her name. There was no answer. A boy came along the trail, and they asked him if he had seen her, and he had not. And then they did the only thing that made any sense at all, which was to assume she had gone on ahead through the brush and rejoined the path and would be sitting on the bus when they got there. They said as much afterward, in almost exactly those words. We thought she would be back at the bus. The time was somewhere around 10 minutes to 3 or 3 o'clock. Those two figures come from different sources, and they are close enough to treat as the same moment. That is the last confirmed sighting of Trenny Lynn Gibson. 2 classmates watching her from behind as she crouched at the edge of the trail, looked at something in the ferns, and stepped down out of view in a borrowed plaid coat, 1/2 mile from the bus, with the fog coming in. Have you ever wondered what it would take for a park that size to swallow a person that fast? The honest answer is that it takes almost nothing. 40 feet of rhododendron will do it. That is what makes the next part of this case so difficult, because the same terrain that could hide an accident perfectly is also the terrain that could hide everything else perfectly. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the students began assembling at the bus. By 3:40, the count was wrong. Somebody asked Robert Simpson where Trenny was, because everyone knew she had gone down to the Bald with him. He said he had hiked to the Bald with her, and that she had left to go back to the bus while he stayed behind, and that after she left, he had spent some time tracking a bear. Nobody had walked back with him. There was no one who could confirm where he had been between the time she left the Bald and the time he arrived at the parking lot. That is not, on its own, suspicious. Half the students on that trail probably had unaccounted for stretches of that afternoon. It is only notable because he was the last person known to have been with her, and because of what came later. I should be careful here about the bear. The claim that Simpson said he had been tracking a bear appears in the early park record and in the books written about the case. But the specific and colourful version of it, the one that circulates online, seems to trace back to a series of books on mysterious disappearances published decades later, and the author of those books did not cite a source for it. So we have a bear story that is probably real in outline and possibly embellished in detail, and it does not actually tell us anything about where Trenny went. I mention it only because it is one of the details people fixate on, and because it is a good example of how this case has accumulated a second layer of story on top of the first. Wayne Dunlap did not wait. He told the rest of the class to stay in the parking lot with the bus, and he went back onto the trail himself with one student to look for her, covering the route to Andrews Bald and toward Double Springs. They found nothing. He got on a CB radio and reached a park technician who came out and helped search. The two men split up and worked different trails and the areas beside them and turned up no sign of her at all. By now, Dunlap understood what he was dealing with. He notified the Park Service. A ranger named Sammy Lyle responded and arrived at the parking lot at 4:30 in the afternoon, was briefed on the situation, and went out to search the Andrews Bald area himself. When he came back without her, he filed the official report that a 16-year-old girl was missing in the park, and the machinery of a full search and rescue operation began to turn. The bus had to go home. There were 38 teenagers standing in a cold parking lot in the dark with no coats and no food and no plan, and at some point somebody made the correct and unbearable decision that they could not stay. Dunlap stayed behind to help search. The bus took his students back to Knoxville without one of them. There is a detail from that bus ride that has stayed with the classmates who are still alive to talk about it. The consensus among the students riding home in the dark was that Trenny had run off with somebody. That is what teenagers concluded, and teenagers are often right about each other, and we will have to come back to that. But it also meant that the first version of this story to reach Knoxville, hours before the professional searchers had even finished their first sweep, was a version in which nothing bad had happened at all. Hope Gibson got the phone call at 8 o'clock that evening. Some accounts say 8:30. She had been at home all day with her 5-year-old, the babysitter she could not find being the reason she was not on that trail herself. Her husband was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on business. She reached him and he got on the first flight he could. She gathered up clothes her daughter had recently worn because she already understood that dogs would need them. And when Bob Sr. landed at the Knoxville airport, they drove straight into the mountains together with an armload of their daughter's clothing in the back seat. They arrived at the search headquarters around midnight. You're in the parking lot at Clingmans Dome at midnight on the 8th of October, 1976. It is raining hard now, and the wind is coming across the ridge, and the fog has not lifted. It has simply gone dark. Roughly 19 searchers had made it up there between 6:30 and 8 in the evening, and they are working with flashlights in conditions where a flashlight beam stops about 8 feet out and comes back at you off the water in the air. Hoarfrost is forming on the rocks and the leaf litter and turning the platforms at the trailhead into something you fall on rather than walk on. Somewhere down that ridge is a girl in a borrowed coat, or she is not, and there's no way to know which. And every hour that passes in weather like this makes the first possibility worse. At 3 in the morning, they called it off until daylight. They had no choice. Continuing in that weather in that terrain would have produced a second casualty, and by then a searcher had already fallen and broken several ribs. Trenny had been gone for 12 hours. In the calculation that search and rescue teams make about survivability, which is cold and necessary, and which her parents were standing right there next to, 12 hours in the low 40s with rain and wind in jeans and a sweater at 6,000 feet is the outer edge of what a healthy person walks away from without shelter. She had a wool coat, if she still had it. That was the only thing on the good side of the ledger. Let's talk about the search, because it was enormous, and because what it found is the reason this case never settled into being a simple story about a lost hiker. At first light on the 9th of October, the operation went to full scale. A ranger named Jack Linehan coordinated it. He closed the road to the public between the Clingmans Dome parking area and Newfound Gap, which shut down the most popular drive in the most visited national park in the country on an October Saturday at the height of leaf season, and gives you some sense of how seriously the Park Service was taking it. Around half a dozen dog teams came in, bloodhounds and German shepherds, handlers from several states. 2 of Trenny's uncles arrived and joined the search with dogs of their own. National Guard helicopters were obtained, but could not lift off until late in the afternoon because of the fog, and when they finally did fly, the haze and the thickness of the canopy made the ground almost useless to look at from above. On foot, it was no better. The hoarfrost had come and gone and come again, and the fallen leaves on top of the wet rock made the slopes genuinely dangerous. Searchers were walking a landscape that resisted being walked on. They covered the ground methodically, everything from the parking lot down to Andrew's Bald, all the side trails, the drainages, the areas off the trail where a person who fell would end up, and near the place where the students had last seen her. They found the first small things, a few ferns broken on the trail, not a trampled area, not a struggle, just a few fronds snapped near where she had been standing when she crouched down. Ferns break if you brush past them, and they break if you step off a trail, and they also break if somebody drags you. And nearby, 3 cigarette butts and a can of beer that had been partly drunk. Now hold that steady, because it is easy to hear that and immediately build a scene around it. And the honest position is that a beer can and 3 cigarette butts near a popular trail in a national park in 1976 are not evidence of anything at all. People smoked everywhere in 1976. People drank on trails. Those items could have been sitting there for a week. They were logged because a competent searcher logs everything, not because they meant something. What happened with the dogs is a different matter. 3 of the tracking dogs picked up Trenny's scent, and they did not pick it up at the last known point and lose it in the brush below. They picked it up at the intersection, where the trail from Andrews Bald meets the path up to the Appalachian Trail. From there, the dogs followed her scent uphill onto the Appalachian Trail and along it, past the observation tower at Clingmans Dome. One dog worked that line for about 1.5 miles. Some of the dogs carried the scent along the roadside and then lost it, roughly 1.5 miles from Newfound Gap, at the paved road, not at a cliff, not at a creek, not in a laurel thicket, at the road. And there was more than that. The dogs also indicated her scent along the Appalachian Trail, running from the tower out toward Collins Gap. Somebody found a set of tennis shoe tracks about the size of Trenny's shoes on the Appalachian Trail heading toward the Double Spring shelter, and followed them until they lost them about 1/2 mile past the trail junction. And when searchers returned the following day to the roadside spot where the scent had ended, they found 8 cigarette butts of a single brand lying there. 8 cigarette butts of the same brand in one place at the exact point where 6 dogs stopped being able to smell a 16-year-old girl. That is the moment this case changed character, because if you take the dog work at face value, then Trenny Gibson did not die of exposure in a ravine below the Forney Ridge Trail. She went off the trail to the right, worked her way through the brush, came out on the path to the Appalachian Trail, walked up past the observation tower, went along the road, and stopped existing at a point where a vehicle could be parked and somebody could stand around long enough to smoke most of a pack of cigarettes. I want to be careful and fair about the limits of that, because scent work is not forensic science in the way fingerprints are, and a video that treats it as proof is doing you a disservice. Tracking dogs are extraordinary, and they are also fallible, and the ways they fail are well documented. They can follow the wrong person. They can follow an older track laid by the same person on a different day, and Trenny had walked part of that ground earlier in the afternoon. They can be influenced without any dishonesty at all by a handler's expectations about where the trail should go. Scent pools and drifts, it moves downhill and collects in low ground, and on a mountain in wind and rain and fog, it does things that are difficult to model. 6 teams working the same terrain within days of each other can also cross-contaminate the ground. And here is the detail that matters most, and that almost nothing published on this case addresses squarely. The clothing given to the dogs came from a household of 6 people, and the coat Trenny was actually wearing that day belonged to somebody else, which means her scent and other people's scent were mixed on both ends of the problem. None of that means the dogs were wrong. Multiple independent teams converging on the same line is genuinely meaningful, and it is the strongest single piece of physical information anyone ever developed in this case. But it is an indication, not a conclusion, and the difference matters when you are about to use it to reason about a living person's guilt. The search went on. It ran at full intensity until the 22nd of October, and then continued at a reduced level until the 2nd of November. When the Park Service finally counted it up, 756 people had searched for Trenny Gibson. Volunteers and rangers and Marines, family members, federal agents and local men who knew those drainages and came up on their own time. They found no trace of her at all. Not a shoe, not a scrap of plaid wool, not a hair tie, not a comb, not a bone. The FBI opened an investigation on the 12th of October, 4 days in That is worth pausing on, because the Bureau does not open a file on a missing hiker. It opens a file when there is reason to believe a federal crime may have occurred. And in 1976, on federal land, that meant kidnapping. The dogs had gone to the road. Somebody in a position to make that call looked at the same information we are looking at now and concluded there was a real possibility that a girl had been taken out of that park in a car. When the search was suspended, the reasoning given was straightforward, and it was not optimism. There was no physical evidence that she was still in the park. The chief ranger told reporters he was almost certain she was not. Park personnel were instructed to stay alert for anything as part of their regular duties, which is the phrase that means the operation is over. Her father did not accept it. In April of the following year, Robert Gibson Sr. organized his own search. It began on the 18th of April, 1977, ran until the 5th of May, and involved 230 people. They did not just work the area around the last sighting. They walked the trails and the ridges and the drainages between Andrews Bald and Elkmont, 15 miles of mountain on the Tennessee side, and between Andrews Bald and Fontana Lake, 14 miles down into North Carolina. That is a search area that assumes a girl might have walked for 2 days before she stopped. It is the kind of search you organize when you cannot stand still. They found nothing either. The park superintendent at the time, Boyd Everson, put out a statement in early May of 1977 that has stayed with people, and I'm going to paraphrase it rather than quote it at length. He said that after everything expended on the search, the possibility remained that she was still somewhere in the park. And then he said that the possibility would be in the mind of every one of them, every time they went into the backcountry from then on. Read that again as a piece of writing by a working park superintendent, and notice what he is actually telling his own staff. You will be thinking about this girl for the rest of your careers. He was right. Searchers went back to the Clingmans Dome area in 1981 and looked again. They found nothing. To be fair to every agency involved, the initial response to this case was fast and it was massive. There was no waiting period, no shrug, no delay while somebody decided whether a teenager was worth looking for. A ranger was on the trail within 90 minutes of the alarm. The road was closed the next morning. 756 people came, and the federal government opened a file inside 4 days. Compared with what happened to a great many missing teenagers in the 1970s, and we will get to that, Trenny Gibson got a real search, and there is still an inconsistency at the center of it that has never been resolved, and it is not a small one. The dogs said she went to a road. The search stayed in the woods. Those two facts sat side by side in the same operation for weeks, and both of them are in the record, and nobody has ever fully explained why the second one did not reshape the first. One more thing about the record, because it shapes everything anyone can say about this case. The Park Service has made its case incident report public through a Freedom of Information request, and that document is the backbone of nearly every reconstruction of the 8th of October that you will ever read, including this one. It is also redacted. Names are blacked out, and the names most likely to be blacked out are the ones belonging to people who were minors in 1976, which is to say, the 38 teenagers who were on that mountain with her. Much of the report is a scan of typewritten and handwritten pages produced in the field by tired people working in the rain and some of it is barely legible. So what we have is a genuine primary source, which is more than most cold cases from that decade offer, and it is a primary source with holes cut in it in exactly the places where the people are. Everything else has come from books, from local news reporting, from the classmates who are still willing to talk, and from a mother who spent 50 years writing letters. Now, we have to talk about people. And before we do, I want to set out the ground rules I am going to hold to for the rest of this, because they matter more here than in almost any case we have covered. No one has ever been charged with anything in connection with the disappearance of Trenny Lynn Gibson. Not arrested, not indicted, not named in a warrant, not accused in any court. Everybody discussed in this section is legally innocent, and that is not a formality I am adding to protect myself. It is the actual state of the evidence. 2 teenage boys have been talked about in this case for 50 years. Both of them were minors in 1976. One of them was affirmatively cleared by an alibi that law enforcement checked. The other has never been charged with any offense connected to Trenny and denies involvement. Almost everything you're about to hear about either of them comes from recollections given decades after the fact by people who were teenagers at the time, in a case where memory has had 50 years and several books and a great many internet threads to work on it. Some of it is probably true. Some of it is probably wrong. None of it has been tested in front of anyone whose job it is to test things. Hold all of it loosely, because I am going to. The first name in the file was Kelvin Bowman. On the 11th of October, 1976, 3 days into the search, Trenny's parents told investigators about something that had happened almost exactly a year earlier. In October of 1975, they said, a young man named Kelvin Bowman, a student at Bearden High, had come into their house at night through Trenny's bedroom window. Hope Gibson shot him in the foot. Bowman was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile correctional facility. He served roughly 6 months and was back at Bearden High by the autumn of 1976. Hope also said that at the hearing, he had made threats against Trenny's life from the courtroom. Her parents became convinced he had followed the school bus into the mountains and taken their daughter. A couple of students said they had seen him driving behind the bus that morning, which naturally hardened that belief into something close to certainty for a mother and father standing in a parking lot at midnight. The police checked it, and it did not hold. Bearden High's principal, Frank Hall, established that Kelvin Bowman had been in class at Bearden the entire day that Trenny disappeared. Wayne Dunlap was adamant that no car followed the bus, and he had a strong point in support of that, which is that nobody outside the class knew where the bus was going. He had deliberately withheld the destination for exactly that reason. A boy in a car in Knoxville cannot follow a bus. He cannot find to a park he does not know it is going to, and he cannot be in 2 counties at once. Whatever Kelvin Bowman was in 1976, he was not in the Great Smoky Mountains on the 8th of October, and law enforcement satisfied itself of that early. And there is a version of the 1975 incident that complicates the whole picture. Speaking to a cold case investigator decades later, Kelvin Bowman denied breaking in at all. He said he and Trenny had been seeing each other quietly for months, that she left her window open for him on a particular night each week, and that what Hope Gibson interrupted that night was not a burglary. Neighbors reportedly saw him limping away down the road after the shooting, which does not fit the account in which he refused to leave. Separately, Trenny had reportedly been seeing a basketball player named Derek Scott until her father caught the two of them sitting in his car. Her parents insisted, then and always, that their daughter never dated anyone and had no interest in boys. Both Kelvin Bowman and Derek Scott were black. This was Knoxville in the 1970s. Researchers who have interviewed people close to that family, Laura Rist among them, have said plainly that they believe Trenny's parents would have suppressed any suggestion that their daughter was involved with a black boy, and that this shaped what the family told investigators from the very first day. I cannot verify that, and I want to be honest that it is an interpretation of motive rather than a documented fact. But it is not a wild interpretation, and it points at something structural rather than personal. If the earliest information reaching investigators was shaped by what a family in that time and place could not say out loud, then the investigation started out running on a partly fictional map, and no amount of good faith downstream fixes that. What the Bowman thread finally leaves us with is this: a teenage boy with a juvenile record and a genuine grievance against that household was checked out and cleared inside a few days, and the two most emotionally compelling reasons to suspect him, the courtroom threat and the car behind the bus, are both unverifiable now. The court records are sealed because he was a juvenile. The students who thought they saw him were teenagers looking at traffic, and the parents who named him were, understandably, the least reliable narrators in the building that week. Which brings us to the objects. Sometime after Trenny disappeared, her star sapphire and diamond ring turned up on the hand of another Bearden High student, a girl in the sophomore class, a year below Trenny, a talented singer who knew her from church as well as from school. She was wearing Trenny's ring. Her pendant was reportedly with her too. Asked how she came to have it, the girl said Trenny had given it to her to hold during the hike. She never returned it to the Gibson family. Robert Simpson gave a different account. He said Trenny had taken the ring off in the washroom and handed it to a girl named Tina Mays to look after. Tina Mays said that was not true, that she had never had Trenny's ring at any point. So there are two explanations for the ring in circulation, and they contradict each other, and the one that would resolve it, the account of the girl who actually had it, was never corroborated by anybody. There is also a third story, which surfaced years later from former Bearden students and has never been confirmed by anyone with a name attached. In that version, Trenny had some kind of altercation with a small group of classmates on the trail that day, and they took the ring off her while holding onto her, and she pulled out of the borrowed jacket and ran off into the woods. That story is unverified and its origin is untraceable, and I would not build anything on it. But it does something useful, which is that it is the only version anybody has offered that explains a ring changing hands, a jacket changing hands, and a girl leaving a trail in a hurry, all in one motion, without anybody planning anything. Sometimes the most economical explanation for a catastrophe is that a group of 16-year-olds did something stupid and then spent the rest of their lives not talking about it. Then there is the comb. Trenny's thick Stanley comb, the one the family said she was never without, turned up on the dashboard of Robert Simpson's car in the days after she vanished. Her brother saw it there. By one account, Simpson had been using it on his own hair. Asked about it, he said Trenny had given it to him to keep for her. Her mother never let go of that. Years later, speaking to the authors of a book on disappearances in the Smokies. She said she had not believed her daughter was lost in those mountains since the third day of the search. She listed the things she could not get past. Her daughter's comb sitting in a friend's car, and that friend never being questioned, and that friend choosing to go tracking a bear instead of walking back to the parking lot with her. Let's talk about Robert Simpson properly, and let's do it carefully. He was 17, a senior, a friend of Trenny's older brother, and the person Bob had asked to look after her that day. He had a car, and Trenny sometimes rode with him. He sat with her on the bus, he lent her his coat, and he ate lunch with her on the board. He was the last person known to have been with her, and he had no witness for the stretch after she left. He was, at one point, considered a suspect. He was never charged. The things that keep his name in this case are these: her comb in his car, his account of the bear with nobody to witness it, his conflicting story about the ring, and his behavior afterward, which several members of the Gibson family found strange. He came to the house repeatedly while Trenny's parents were up in the mountains searching. Tina, Trenny's 14-year-old sister, said he was there more than once. Another sister said he was screening the family's telephone calls, and nobody has ever explained why a 17-year-old boy would be answering that family's phone that week. And Tina reported that he said something to her that she never forgot, which was that if Kelvin Bowman had Trenny, then he would kill her, and that if he did not have her, then she had probably run off with a hitchhiker. He was also one of only a handful of students who took an active part in the search, and he stayed close to the case. That last fact cuts both ways, and it is important to say so. A boy who was asked by his friend to look after a girl, and who then had to stand in a parking lot and say he did not know where she was, would have every reason on earth to search obsessively, to hover around her family, to make himself useful, to be the one answering the phone. Guilt and grief and adolescent shame produce behavior that looks identical from the outside. There are people in this world who have spent 50 years being talked about because at 17 they responded badly to something unbearable. In recent years, a cold case investigator named Michael Bouchard, a man with decades in law enforcement, worked through this case in correspondence with Hope Gibson and by reviewing statements and the released Park file. He has published his conclusions in a book, and in interviews he has been direct about them. He does not think Trenny was a lost person. He thinks this was a homicide. He thinks it happened in the park, and he does not think she is more than about 3 miles from where she disappeared. 2 of the things he surfaced are new enough that they reopen the argument. The first is a photograph. Looking through material from the search, Bouchard found an image that appears to show Robert Simpson wearing a distinctive plaid CPO jacket during the search days. Hope Gibson, shown the photograph, was certain it was the same coat she had seen her daughter wearing when she left for school that morning, the coat she had heard Simpson say he had lent her. If that identification is right, and it rests on a mother's eye and a pattern of wool in an old photograph rather than on anything forensic, then it raises one clean question. At some point, between the middle of that afternoon and the search, that jacket came back off Trenny and returned to him. Nobody has ever accounted for how, and it also introduces a possibility about the dogs that nobody considered in 1976, which is that a person walking those trails in a coat Trenny had worn all day would lay down a scent trail that dogs might read as hers. The second thing is an account from Trenny's brother. During the search, Simpson drove Bob home one night, and because it was late, Bob invited him to stay over. Bob said that when Simpson changed, he had vertical scratches running down both thighs to the knees. Simpson explained them as the result of pushing through thickets in the park while searching, which is a completely ordinary explanation for scratched legs in that terrain. To Bob, they looked like fingernail marks, and he noted that Simpson habitually wore heavy work pants that showed no corresponding damage. Bouchard's theory, and I want to label it clearly as one investigator's published theory rather than a finding, is that something violent happened between Trenny and Simpson in the park, that she fought and got away, and that he caught up with her afterward. There is a serious problem with it, and Bouchard acknowledges the problem himself. Trenny was seen alive by multiple classmates after she parted from Simpson, walking normally in good spirits at speed. Nobody saw the two of them together again. For the theory to work, he has to have gone off trail, moved parallel to the path faster than a fast walker walking downhill, and intercepted her, which is possible in that terrain for someone who knew it and had reportedly been in the park before, and is also a great deal to assume. There is one more oddity worth naming. A friend of Simpson's, a Bearden student named Greg Nichols, took part in the search and said he had been on the field trip and had seen Trenny shortly before she went missing, describing her as happy and untroubled. His name does not appear on the roster for that trip. That could be a clerical omission on a form filled out in 1976 by a school with 39 kids on a bus. It could be a boy inserting himself into a dramatic event, which teenagers do. It could be something else entirely, and there is no way now to establish which. It is unresolved, like everything else here. And finally, there is the matter of the file. Hope Gibson said that she and her husband brought their suspicions about Simpson to both the Park Service and the FBI, and that both agencies brushed them aside, telling her he was too young to question. Robert Simpson's father was a federal prosecutor. That fact has fueled 50 years of speculation that a well-connected family shielded a boy from scrutiny, and Bouchard's published position is that the federal investigation was obstructed by exactly that. I want to be scrupulous here. I have seen no documentation of any interference of any kind. What is documented is narrower and stranger than that. The National Park Service has released its file on Trenny Gibson. The FBI, half a century on, has not released its own. So let's talk about what actually happened, and let's do it the honest way, which means laying out each possibility with the evidence that supports it and the evidence that damages it, and then admitting where we end up. There are 4 real theories in this case, and one non-theory I want to deal with and set aside. The first theory is the simplest one. Trenny stepped off the trail for an ordinary reason, and she died out there. You're in her shoes for a moment. Something catches your eye downhill and to the right. Maybe a plant, on a horticulture field trip, on the one day of the year you are being graded on noticing plants. Maybe you need a moment of privacy, which for a 16-year-old girl on a trail with 38 classmates is a completely sufficient reason to step into the ferns. Either way, you go 10 yards down a slope, and the slope is steeper than it looked, and it is wet, and you go down. Or you get turned around in fog that closes the distance to 20 feet, and you walk in the wrong direction for 10 minutes, and by then, everything looks the same. That is not a stretch. That is the most common way people die in these mountains, and the park's own classification of Trenny's case still, today, is lost or injured missing. Here is what argues against it. 756 people searched. They searched a corridor around a trail less than a mile from a parking lot, with dogs on the ground, from the air, for 3 weeks. And then 230 more people searched 15 miles of ridges the following spring. And they came back again in 1981. 50 years of hikers have walked the Forney Ridge Trail since, at the rate of hundreds of thousands a year, and the Appalachian Trail crosses just above it. Bears and hogs and coyotes work the ground constantly, and they move things. In half a century, nobody has found a shoe. Nobody has found a piece of plaid wool. Nobody has found a ring, which is the sort of object that survives everything and turns up decades later in a creek bed. And the dogs went to the road. To be fair to this theory, absence of remains is weaker evidence than it feels like. That terrain has swallowed people. A body can go into a rock crevice under a rhododendron slick and never be visible from 3 feet away, and the acidic soil and the animals do the rest inside a few seasons. The park has other cases where the person was almost certainly right there and was never found. So this theory is not dead. It is only deeply uncomfortable, which is a different thing. The second theory is that Trenny left on purpose. This was the immediate conclusion of her own classmates on the bus ride home, which is not nothing. Teenagers know things about each other that adults do not. A classmate named Kim Pouncey said in an interview decades later that she had always felt Trenny planned it, that somebody was waiting for her in the park, and that this was her way out. If the researchers who describe an unhappy, tightly controlled home are right, and if there was a relationship her parents would not tolerate, then the motive exists, and the scent trail supports the mechanics of it perfectly. A girl walks off a trail, works uphill, follows the Appalachian Trail past the tower, comes out on a road, and gets into a car. That is exactly what the dogs described. But the arguments against it are, in my view, close to decisive, and they are all made of small, ordinary objects. She left her purse in her mother's car that morning. She left her identification. She left $200 in a drawer at home, and more than $1,000 in a savings account she never touched again. She left the antibiotics she was taking for an infected foot. She had no coat and had to borrow one from a boy on the bus. Her brother, the person she was closest to on earth, was home on leave from the Navy for the first time in months, and she knew it. She had never been to the Great Smoky Mountains, and she did not know the class was going there until she was already sitting on the bus, which makes a prearranged pickup on a specific mountain road effectively impossible to organize. And having supposedly planned her escape, she first walked 1.75 miles downhill to a meadow, ate half a sandwich, and walked most of the way back. Runaways take money. Runaways take a coat. Runaways, in 50 years, touch a bank account, or call a brother, or turn up in a phone book under a married name. Nothing has ever surfaced. She would be 65 years old now, and in 50 years, there has never been a substantiated sighting of her anywhere. The third theory is that she was taken from the roadside by a stranger. This is the theory the FBI's involvement implies, and the physical trace evidence fits it. The dogs converge on a paved road in a place where cars park. 8 cigarette butts of one brand are lying on the ground, there the next day, which is what a stretch of waiting looks like. It is 1976, and it is the height of leaf season in the most visited national park in America. So there is traffic on that road, and hitchhiking is normal, and getting into a stranger's car is a thing ordinary people did without thinking about it. The trouble is coincidence. For this to work, a girl has to leave a trail for innocent reasons, become lost, climb to the Appalachian Trail, walk past the observation tower, reach the road, and arrive there in the same few minutes as somebody willing to abduct her. Each step is plausible. The chain is long, and there is no reported incident, no witness, no vehicle description, and no similar case in that park in that period that anyone has ever tied to it. The fourth theory is that she was harmed by somebody who was already there. The evidence for it is the material we went through in the last section. Her comb in a car, her ring on another student's hand with 2 contradictory explanations, a borrowed jacket that appears to be back in its owner's possession during the search, unwitnessed time, odd behavior in the days afterward, scratches with an innocent explanation that a family member did not accept, a federal file that has stayed closed for 50 years. The evidence against it is equally real. Trenny was seen alive and alone by at least 4 classmates after she separated from anyone. She was walking fast and appeared fine. No one saw her with anybody in the last stretch. For a fellow student to have caught her, he has to have moved through off-trail terrain faster than she moved on the trail. And 50 years is a very long time for a secret held by a teenager to survive contact with alcohol, marriage, divorce, illness, and a deathbed. And this one has not surfaced from anyone. I have laid those out as 4 theories, but I do not actually think they are 4. Look at them again and notice that the second, third, and fourth all pass through the same doorway, which is the road, and the only thing they disagree about is who was standing next to the car. The dog work is the hinge of this entire case. If it is right, then the first theory is finished, and the argument is only about consent and identity. If it is unreliable, and it might be, then 756 people spent 3 weeks searching the wrong idea, and Trenny Gibson has been lying within 3 miles of that parking lot since the autumn of 1976, which is precisely what the investigator who has worked this case most recently believes. And now, the non-theory. Trenny's disappearance was absorbed decades after it happened into a body of writing that treats vanishings in national parks as evidence of something unnatural. Her name appears in those books alongside patterns about weather and boulders and berry bushes, and a fair amount of what circulates about her online, including the more elaborate version of the bear story, traces back to that source without a citation attached. I want to be plain about why we do not tell it that way here. The Smokies do not need any help. That is 800 square miles of nearly vertical, densely vegetated, fog-bound, drainage-cut mountain, where a person becomes invisible at 40 feet and inaudible at 80 in cold rain at 6,000 feet in October. Geography explains everything the mystery framing claims to explain, and it does it without asking you to believe anything strange. And there is a cost to the other way of telling it, which is that Trenny stops being a 16-year-old girl with an infected foot and a savings account and becomes an entry in a pattern. Her family had to read those entries. Have you ever wondered what the people in these cases would want said about them? We cannot know. But her mother spent the last decades of her life pressing 2 institutions for 1 file, and her classmates spent them planting a tree. And neither of those is the behavior of people who found the mystery satisfying. So where does that leave us honestly? It leaves us with a case where the strongest physical evidence points off the mountain and the strongest recent investigative work points back onto it. It leaves us with 2 boys who were never charged and one of whom was cleared outright. It leaves us with a comb, a ring, and a coat, none of which prove anything and all of which have to be explained by somebody. And it leaves us with a federal file sitting in a building somewhere that would probably settle at least part of this in an afternoon. Let's talk about what a disappearance does to the people who are left standing in the parking lot, because this is the part that most true crime coverage skips. And it lasted 50 years. Start on the Monday. The bus had come home on Friday night without her, and on Monday morning the school opened, as schools do. In one classroom, a teacher who had not been told anything began calling the roll, the way she had every morning that autumn. She got to Trenny's name and read it out. She looked up and waited, and nobody answered. She asked where Trenny was, and several students had to tell their teacher that a girl in her class had gone missing on a field trip on Friday and had not been found. One of those students, Michelle Decker, described what happened next many years later, and she has never lost the picture of it. The teacher slumped down in her chair and said, "Oh no," and then she started crying. Trenny's name was never called in that room again. Think about how many people in that building found out that way. Not from an assembly, not from a letter home, just from a name read off a list into a silence. Wayne Dunlap, the teacher who took 39 students up a mountain alone because nobody else would give up a Friday, was never accused of anything. And by every account, he did everything correctly once he knew. He also could not carry it. He resigned from his teaching position not long afterward and left the profession. A man who taught teenagers about plants because he loved plants and loved teaching lost both of those things on the 8th of October, 1976. The Gibsons tried to hold together, and they tried in the most practical way available to them. They sold the house on Witowa Drive and moved to a different neighborhood because every room and every window in that house had her in it, and the poodle was still getting up on the back of the couch to watch the street. Moving does not work. It has never worked for any family in this position, and they knew that, and they did it anyway because the alternative was staying. In the years that followed, Robert Gibson Sr. and Hope Gibson divorced. That is a sentence that gets one line in most write-ups of this case, and it deserves more. Losing a child to a disappearance rather than to a death denies a family the one thing that makes grief survivable, which is a shared story. There is no funeral, no date, no cause, no ending. 2 parents standing in the same kitchen can hold 2 completely different beliefs about whether their daughter is alive, and every conversation for the rest of their lives runs into that. Her father organized a 230-person search of 30 miles of mountains a year and a half after the professionals stopped. Her mother had decided by the 3rd day that her daughter was never in those mountains at all. Both of them were doing everything they could, and they were doing it in opposite directions. Then the family began to run out of people. Robert Jr., the brother who was home on leave that week, the one who held 2 fingers together to show a reporter how close they were, died in 2000 at the age of 42. Their father died in 2004 at 67, having spent 28 years looking. Tina, the 14-year-old sister who had a boy screening her family's phone calls in the week her sister vanished, died in 2016 at 54. Many of Trenny's classmates have died too, which is what happens to a class 50 years out from graduation. And every one of those deaths took a piece of the case with it. The cold case investigator working this now says that plainly. The single biggest obstacle in front of him is that the people who are on that trail are dying. Hope Gibson has outlived most of it. She has kept talking, kept corresponding with anyone who would work the case, and kept asking the same institutions the same question for half a century. Now I want to put this case in its era for a moment, because it is easy to look at 1976 from here and assume incompetence where the truth is worse and more ordinary. You're in the United States in 1976, and there is no national system for missing children. There is no clearinghouse, no photograph distribution network, no coordinated database that a small city police department can query. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children will not exist for another 8 years. The federal law that finally forbade police departments from imposing waiting periods before taking a missing child report and required them to enter that child into the National Crime Database is 14 years away. In 1976, if a teenager went missing in America, the default institutional assumption was runaway, and the default institutional response was to wait and see whether she called. Set against that, Trenny Gibson's case is genuinely unusual. She got a ranger on the trail within 90 minutes. She got the road closed, dog teams from multiple states, National Guard helicopters, Marines, 756 searchers, and a federal file opened inside 4 days. Whatever went wrong here, it was not indifference at the front end. The Park Service treated the 8th of October, 1976, as an emergency, because that is what a park does when a child is loose in the backcountry with weather coming. What that machinery was not built for was the possibility that the emergency had already ended before the search began, and that the actual work was not search and rescue, but a criminal investigation involving juveniles in 2 states, on federal land, with a school district and a set of parents and 38 teenage witnesses whose accounts had already been shaped by 2 days of talking to each other. Nobody in 1976 had a playbook for that, which is to say the failure in this case, if there was one, is not that they did not look hard enough. It is that they may have been looking for the wrong kind of thing, and the window in which the other kind of thing could have been established closed while everyone was still up on that ridge in the fog. She is also not the only one. Great Smoky Mountains National Park carries a small number of unresolved missing persons cases, and Trenny is one of a handful listed by the Park Service itself. 7 years before her, in 1969, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin vanished in a game of hide-and-seek at Spence Field in the same park in front of his family, and one of the largest searches in the park's history never found him. 2 years after Trenny, a Knoxville businessman named Mike Heron disappeared from the Tremont area. Those cases have almost nothing in common with each other beyond the ground they happened on. What they establish is that this mountain range has taken people and kept them repeatedly across generations in circumstances that varied completely. The Smokies do not have a pattern. What they have is a capacity, and it has never gone away. So where does the case stand today? It is open and it is unsolved. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is listed as an investigating agency. The Park Service still lists her among its unresolved cases, still classified as lost or injured. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children still carries her poster, with a photograph of a 16-year-old girl and beside it an age progression that shows what she might look like in her 60s, which is one of the quieter and more difficult things that organization does. She would be 65 now. She's been missing for longer than she was alive by a factor of 3. The National Park Service has released its file. The FBI has not. And there is no public explanation for why a federal file on a 50-year-old missing child case cannot be opened, which has fed a great deal of speculation that I cannot verify and will not repeat as fact. And her classmates have not let it go. In the last couple of years, the Bearden High class she would have graduated with planted a tree at the school with a plaque with her name on it. They have been giving interviews to local television, pushing to keep her name in circulation and pressing whoever will listen for movement on the case. They are approaching their 50th reunion. One of them put it about as directly as it can be put, saying that 50 years later, they were going to have a reunion. And she is just not with them. So this is where we are, almost 50 years on. On the 8th of October, 1976, Trenny Lynn Gibson walked down a mountain trail ahead of her classmates, crouched at the edge of it to look at something, stepped off to the right, and was never seen again. No trace of her has ever been recovered. 6 dog teams followed her scent uphill, past an observation tower, and out to a paved road, where it ended. No one has ever been arrested or charged. One person of interest was cleared by an alibi that was checked at the time. Another was looked at and never questioned in any meaningful way, and is presumed innocent, and has never been accused in any court of anything. Her case is open, and the federal file on it has never been released. That is the whole of what we know. Everything else in this story is a theory, including the ones I find most persuasive. Have you ever wondered how much of a case like this is actually about the missing person, and how much of it is about the rest of us and what we can bear to conclude? 50 years of argument about a comb on a dashboard, a ring on a classmate's finger, a coat in an old photograph, a set of scratches on somebody's legs. Every one of those arguments is about the adults who are teenagers on that trail. None of them are about her. So let me put her back in the middle of it, because that is where she belongs. Behind the case file was a 16-year-old girl from West Knoxville who had already decided what she wanted to do with her life. Not in a vague way, the way most of us decide things at 16, but specifically enough that she had enrolled in a horticulture class to start on it, and had picked the university, and had been saving cafeteria wages toward it since she was old enough to work, landscape architecture. She wanted to spend her working life arranging living things in ways that would outlast her. That is not a common ambition for a 16-year-old in 1976 or any other year. She was quiet. Every single person who has spoken about her in 5 decades has used that word, and the ones who are still alive still use it, which suggests it was true rather than convenient. Quiet and nice and a good student, and not a girl who caused problems. She was careful with her money in a way that would have made her a good adult. She was close enough to her older brother that he could not explain it in words and had to hold up 2 fingers pressed together. She had a foot infection she was taking medicine for, and she went hiking anyway because she was 16 and it was a field trip and she loved the subject. She had a poodle named Mitzi, who used to get up on the back of the couch and watch out the upstairs window for her, and who kept doing that for days after the 8th of October. And nobody in that family could bring themselves to explain to the dog what had happened, because there was nothing to explain. Nobody knew, and she was somebody's daughter who never came home from a school trip, which is a category of loss that should not exist, and which every parent hearing this understands instantly and completely. You're in a high school parking lot in West Knoxville in the present day, and there is a young tree there with a plaque at the base of it and her name on the plaque. Her classmates put it there more than 4 decades after they last saw her, out of their own pockets, because they were the ones on that bus and because they are the last people alive who remember her as a person rather than a case. Some of them have made it their business in their 60s to keep her name in the local news. A tree is a strange and perfect memorial for a girl who wanted to study landscape architecture, and I do not know whether they thought of that when they chose it, and it does not matter. It is the right marker. So tonight, as you think about Trenny's story, I would ask you to remember her the way those classmates do, which is not as a disappearance. Remember a girl on a bus at 9 in the morning, in good spirits, borrowing a coat because she had guessed the weather wrong, on her way to look at trees at the top of a mountain she had never seen. That happened. That part is not disputed by anyone. Whatever came later, she had that morning, and by every account she was happy in it. There's something else worth sitting with, and it is not comfortable. This case did not go unsolved for lack of effort. 756 people walked those mountains for her inside a month, and 230 more the following spring. And a father kept looking for 28 years, and a mother kept asking for 50. What was missing was not manpower, and it was not love. What was missing was somebody early on who was willing to look at a scent trail that ended at a road and follow the implication of it all the way, including into the parts of that community where the questions would have been unwelcome. Cases like this are usually not lost in the wilderness. They are lost in the gap between the agencies, in the week when everyone is still hoping, and in what the people involved could not say out loud in the place and time they were living, which is the argument for paying attention and for not letting a name become a genre. There are people alive right now who were on that trail. There is a file in a federal building that could be read in an afternoon. There is a woman who's been asking for it since Gerald Ford was president. None of those 3 things is beyond reach. Trenny Lynn Gibson was 16 years old, and she has been missing since a rainy Friday afternoon in October of 1976, and she is still owed an answer. Somebody on that mountain knew what happened to her. Some of them are still here,